considered by MCPR. Recently, the nation saw tragedy when 18-year-old Nicholas Cruz stormed Parkland High School in Florida. Armed with an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle and many magazines, Cruz entered Building 12 of the school at around 2:20 p.m. on February 14th, 2018. Soon after, he activated a fire alarm to draw victims out of classrooms and began firing at anyone in his path. While a lockdown was called, the school resource officer did not engage with Cruz. After 6 minutes of gunfire, Cruz dropped his rifle in the building and escaped the scene, following fleeing students. Already there has been lots of controversy over media coverage of the event, which has become highly politicized over the hot issue of gun control and has sparked the student rallying cry, "Enough is enough," on social media. Is the media's coverage of the Parkland shooting really so critical to our understanding of the event? Let's find out. Today we meet with 3 leading media analysts who will share their thoughts on the coverage of the shooting. Welcome Savannah Lee, Emma Corcoran, Caroline Hallmark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, to begin, what sorts of overarching patterns do you see in the way media is treating the events at Parkland?
With the shooting being so recent, a lot of new information is still coming out. Because of this minute-to-minute coverage, every new fact of the investigation is being highly publicized. This, I think, has 2 consequences for readers. First, when every new development is treated as a major breakthrough, it makes it harder to discern what is and what isn't important to the overall narrative. Second, it becomes quite difficult on the readers' part to verify the validity of the information being reported on. Nonetheless, we have found there to be several basic themes common in the coverage of the event. First, it should be noted that a lot of media attention is going towards this shooter, Nicholas Cruz. A recent NBC article covering the event devoted the entire first half of the article to describing him. The placement of the part about Cruz at the beginning of the article is telling of what the publisher wants to communicate to their readers. Being the first thing the reader sees, the information at the beginning sticks more permanently in our minds. While I understand that the nation desperately wants to know what kind of person would commit such a terrible crime and why, it should also be noted that this type of coverage detracts from the victims' perspectives. As you tear apart the perpetrator's troubled past, we miss what the victims themselves have to say. On this note, we found that there is a noticeable lack of Parkland students' responses in the media. The same NBC article mentioned before focused primarily on law enforcement and governmental responses to the shooting. While they even interviewed parents' reactions to the shootings, only 2 sentences are devoted to what students themselves had to say. Whether this omission of student perspectives is purposeful or not, without student voice, their viewpoint on why this happened and how to prevent it in the future is marginalized. Only mentioning how politicians such as President Donald Trump or Governor Rick Scott may respond to the shooting, the media ignores the students' potential as activists in the process of reform in the wake of this tragedy.
Wow, thank you. It's fascinating how the omission of certain perspectives on the shooting can play such a large role in the understanding of an event that you receive through the media. It seems like in this article, by being silenced, Parkland students are being forced very clearly into the identity of victims, implying them to be weak and voiceless in the face of political opposition. How else does specific language in these articles fit the patterns you've seen?
While I agree that the article did clearly lack student perspectives, this could also be because of how quickly they broke the story. At the time it was written, many of the students were likely still in shock and mourning, meaning that reporters really couldn't possibly have respectfully interviewed students. However, the article did mention how several politicians felt, as Caroline said. The article called Rick Scott, quote, a Republican whom the National Rifle Association Political Victory Fund gave an A+ rating, also mentioning that he, quote, didn't directly answer reporters' questions. By choosing to include this information, the reader's view of Rick Scott can be heavily skewed, and Scott himself appears to be heavily biased in favor of the NRA. The article also focuses on government oversight and paints officials out to be incompetent. They mention that, quote, the FBI was alerted 6 months ago after a YouTube user named Nicholas Cruz posted a comment stating, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." suggesting that the FBI could have prevented the tragedy altogether. Immediately after this, they mentioned that Cruz's mother died early in November, insinuating heavily that this event could have played a part in leading to the shooting.
Yeah, I mean, the story was broken very quickly, yeah. But the coverage of the event quite possibly could have been missing many key features that may have not been available at the time it was published. Like, I agree that the students weren't put in this article because it was right after the shooting, but the NBC article did give a link to the names of the victims. The addition of this, puts the readers in a better position to understand the severity of the story without actually talking about the victims. This article was one of the first, but many came after that went into further depths about the students and the damage that was done. In the CNN article that we looked at, it was published a few days after the shooting, and the gunman was mostly the focus, but there were also a few perspectives of the students that were at the school at the time of the shooting. The victims in that article weren't very publicized, but we can only assume that is because, like Savannah said, the shooting was still very recent and families didn't want to discuss it yet. The NBC article heavily covered Cruz, but again, we can only assume that the reason why is because of how new this news was. They left out many other key parts of the event, describing more the foreshadowing to the shooting that led up to it. NBC mentioned that Cruz had a YouTube account and even posted a comment that said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter," like Savannah said. What readers were getting was more of the immediate aftermath of the event involving Cruz, as well as the foreshadowing of his crime, rather than the detailed analysis you might see in the weeks and months following its tragedy.
So, bias in this article might not just be due to the author's political leading, but might simply have to do with the quick timing they're published in to appear the breaking news. Apart from this, do you see anything different in the media coverage of Parkland compared to a lot of previous school shootings?
Traditionally, we've seen the political energy of these kinds of tragedies peter out as time goes on. As people move on, there's less demand on politicians to create lasting reform. A major reason for this has to do with media coverage. As readers lose interest in an event, the media, especially in the fast-paced world of digital journalism, stops reporting on it. Already, however, we've noticed that news coverage of Parkland is following a different trajectory. While on one hand we've seen lots of traditional coverage, as in the NBC article I previously mentioned, it should also be noted that the Parkland students seem to have already taken a more active role than other school shooting victims have in the past. A CNN article I recently read interviewed Parkland senior David Hogg in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. While the NBC article we talked about earlier focused primarily on non-student accounts, this CNN article was exclusively just dedicated to Hogg. What I found most interesting about this article is that it portrays the students in an active, as opposed to a passive, role in the aftermath of the shooting. As the sole interviewee in the article, all media attention is focused completely on Hogg and what he believes should be done in the future. Treating the student body as having a legitimate voice in the political process could be the key to change. While in the past, students have not typically had a platform on which to speak out, having those who are actually affected by the shooting become leaders of the national call for change may prove to be more sustainable and impactful. It is more meaningful to hear what needs to change directly from those affected. Whether or not this student-driven energy will last long enough to enact some real change in the form of legislation is the real question.
Okay, so how do you predict the rest of the Parkland school shooting coverage will compare to past coverage of school shootings?
Well, in other school shootings, we've seen similar patterns to the way that Parkland shooting was portrayed in the media. Like, in the direct aftermath, we have articles focusing mainly on the criminal and what was being done to reform him or her, as well as the motive for shooting. However, the Parkland shooting was so infamous and atrocious, it has been classified hard to compare to other school shootings. The Parkland shooting has been mainly compared to the Sandy Hook shooting, where 20 children and 6 teachers were killed at the hand of a gun. As Caroline said, the coverage and motivation of shootings as they continue to happen cause the event to slowly die out until another terrible crime occurs. The placement of these stories depends on how relevant they are in the news and in the public. After every shooting, we have intense coverage of the event until it slowly dies out. The Parkland shooting proved to be somewhat different, though, as the survivors of the shooting made sure to keep the event publicized and talked about it for as long as possible. In the CNN article, we saw perspectives of the student survivors that gave something new, something for readers to latch onto. Students discussed the events from their own perspectives rather than the perspectives written out by a news article. In this sense, the coverage of the Parkland shooting compared to others became bigger in the media by day.
Interesting perspectives. So, could you go more in depth on how exactly this difference in the portrayal of students is significant?
So, the CNN article really leaned in portraying Hogg as a journalist and activist, a stark contrast to the way the NBC article portrayed the survivors. The opening paragraphs describe Hogg's actions during the shooting, illustrating his dedication to both journalism and activism. They point out that, though his life was on the line, he continued to courageously interview other students in the hope that he could make real change, regardless of whether they lived or died. Directly below this, a carousel of images are displayed showing texts between another survivor and her sister. The placement of these images furthers the narrative that, despite very real and imminent danger, Hogg was still bravely trying to show the world what it's like to be in a school shooting to garner support for his cause. The article then turns to talk about Hogg's life, particularly in the context of school. By mentioning his interests and details about his daily life, readers will see him as a person with more dimension, garnering still more sympathy and making it harder to ignore the fact that he's just like the rest of us, and gun violence could easily affect anyone you know.
Yeah, exactly. The students in this event were ones who would not let it be forgotten. The positioning of the images as well as the interview with Hogg just goes to show that even in the aftermath of the shooting, the students were immediately ready to fight to change what had been wrong for so long. The portrayal of these students set off a chain of events that followed the shooting. As Savannah said, these students are just like us, and the Parkland students wanted to make sure that the event would not just be another one to be forgotten.
Thank you very much to Caroline, Emma, and Savannah for joining us today. Your perspectives on bias in the Parkland news coverage is really invaluable to our understanding of the event and how it will affect American society and politics. In terms of the content of articles, at the time of the shooting, we saw a lot of breaking news stories with sparse details and not much effort to focus on multiple viewpoints. While there was not much effort to fix bias in the article, most likely this was due to time considerations rather than intentional bias. But this still shows problems in the way we consume news events, as people tend to formalize opinions quickly after they first see information. However, in the first CNN article, which was written a relatively long time after the event, we see a lot more of what appears to be intentional rather than coincidental bias. Emotive language used throughout, such as referring to top moments and describing protests poetically, saying that there were, quote, words echoing through streets, creates a much more positive tone towards the students, rather than using the more neutral tone of a first article. Altogether, you cannot really say that one article is more biased than another, because both of them have strengths and weaknesses that are potentially problematic. For the best understanding of the event, it would be ideal to recognize these weaknesses and to try to fill them in with multiple news perspectives, both in ideology and time post-event, even though, of course, this is an ideal that takes a lot of careful attention and media knowledge to do well as reading lots of articles. This was All Things Considered by MCPR. The date is October 7th, 2018, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.